Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or seeking to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as clinical psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney Wilkinson and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. Richard, as far as you know, has anybody invented a time machine yet?
Back to the Future, a DeLorean.
Well, they've invented DeLoreans.
That was a DeLorean.
Yeah, but not time machines.
You're surprised that I knew that, weren't you?
No.
I never saw that movie, but I know that they used a DeLorean in it.
That surprised me. Well, it doesn't surprise me.
No, nobody has invented a time machine.
And because the reason I'm asking...
Why are you asking?
Is because here we are, we're recording these podcasts for the first week of May.
I know where you're going now.
But what did we miss last month?
April was Autism Month.
Autism Awareness Month was April.
That's right.
And we missed it.
But that's okay. But I don't mind. You know why?
Why?
Because in a sense, I may have chosen to miss it on purpose.
Oh.
I mean, I might, if I sat and thought about it for a long time, I might have decided, let's not do anything during Autism Month, let's wait. And you may say, well, why would you do that? Because...
Well, that's going to come up in a future podcast. We're going to talk about...
It is?
Yeah.
Well, then I'll wait.
Hold on.
I have impulse control.
Okay. All right, so...
Sometimes.
But today, this week we're going to talk about autism.
Right. So this is actually, we're in May.
Right.
But we're going to do a retrospective about autism.
Right.
But it's a serious topic.
Right, because whether it's April, May, or November, we need to think about what autism is and think about what the families are going through. And so we're going to spend this week talking about autism.
Right. Mm-hmm.
All right. So today we're going to talk about what autism actually is.
Right.
And why it seems as though things have changed so much over the past couple of years.
Right. Right.
So, autism is a developmental disorder, a developmental condition that begins to manifest early in childhood.
Right.
Now,
it's neurodevelopmental in the sense that you probably have it at birth.
Right.
Whatever it is, it's probably present at birth, but reveals itself sometime after birth.
Right. And so when we think about the sort of the developmental progression of autism, it usually manifests during the it's usually diagnosed during the second year of life or so. Mm-hmm. However, there's been some interesting research sort of retrospective research, where they took kids who were diagnosed with autism at 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, and they got video of their first birthday, and blind reviewers were able to look at those videos and identify and differentiate between children who were later diagnosed with autism, those who were later diagnosed with intellectual disabilities but not autism, and normally developing children.
Because what happened, there were studies done about eye tracking in infants.
Right.
Okay. What we have to remember is that it's not until about age 2.5 or 3 that you have a large enough repertoire of behaviors to say this child is not doing what we expect across a range of behaviors. It's hard to do that at 6 months of age because we don't have a large repertoire of behaviors at 6 months of age.
There's only a couple of things that you would see at that age, and so we have to wait until they get a little bit older, where we're expecting them to be talking, where we're expecting them to have some interactions with other people, and that's when we can start to see some divide in that developmental path of those who end up being normally developing and those who end up presenting with autism traits. Now, autism is a condition that it's sort of diagnosed based upon deficiencies in 3 areas. The first is communication. And when we think about communication, we're not just talking, and notice that we're not talking about, we didn't say speech and language. We're talking about communication. Because communication is both verbal and nonverbal communication.
Right. Mm-hmm. And we probably I mean, experts are now saying that we probably communicate more non-verbally than we do verbally.
Right.
So it is both.
Right. Because I can...
What?
See what?
Oh, yeah.
I just look.
I was intimidated.
And you can see... you can read so much in those nonverbal
That's right.
cues.
Somebody's sitting there shaking their head no with downcast eyes. That sends a very strong message.
Right. And unfortunately, individuals with autism tend to not pick up on those. Or if they pick up on them, they misread them.
Well, they not only don't perceive them in others, they don't express them themselves.
Right.
They don't express or receive.
Right.
Verbal or nonverbal communication.
Right, right. So we do have those with autism who end up being nonverbal. They maybe never speak.
Right.
Or they begin to speak early in life and then they lose the ability to communicate. We see that as well.
And that used to be a puzzle, but I think it was solved because as a species we talk.
Right.
Noam Chomsky said we have this black box in our brain and speech just comes out of it.
Right.
And it comes out of it for children with autism, but because of their other difficulties, there's no point in continuing to speak. It's not that they lose the ability.
Right.
They just don't develop the ability as others do.
Yeah, they don't maintain that.
Yeah, we always used to think that they lost the ability to speak. They didn't. They had the ability, they used it, didn't do them any good, so they stopped.
Right, right. So we have that sort of spectrum of presentation with their verbal skills from completely nonverbal to very verbal.
Right.
There are those with autism who are very verbal, have a great vocabulary, and exactly what we call hyperlexic. They are really strong verbally. But with the nonverbal communication, we see a similar spectrum where there are those who don't gesture, who have a very flat affect. They don't engage in any of those nonverbals that we. So when you think about a young child who wants the cup that's on the counter, they can't reach it. They're standing there crying and having a fit, and the parent is trying to figure out what the child wants, but these children don't even point to what they want. They don't have any indication of what they're looking for.
Right, they can't express.
Right. Yeah. So, and then all the way up to, of course, those who are have inappropriate nonverbal communication.
Right.
So they get too close and
Violate.
they violate some of those personal space rules that we have.
Right. They get too close because they just don't understand normal social interaction. They don't perceive it. They don't learn it. It doesn't develop. Right. And so they violate social customs.
Right. Which takes us right into the second area where those with autism have problems, and that is the social domain.
Right.
For many of the same reasons that we were just talking about with communication, individuals with autism tend to have deficits in social interactions and social communication.
Right.
They don't tend to make friends as easy, or if they make friends, they make them very quickly, but then they have difficulty sustaining relationships.
Relationships, right. And that's probably one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest heartaches for parents is that their children start to get left out. They start to get they don't get invited to parties. They don't have friends. They don't have play dates because other kids don't want to play with them because they play inappropriately. And it's heartbreaking for parents, especially to see their children get ostracized in that way. But that happens, and it continues to happen probably throughout their life. Right.
Now the third area is in the area of basically behavior, but it has to do with behaviors and areas of interest, and what they present with is a very restricted range. So these are individuals who, when we see it in young kids, there's almost this typical progression of a very fixed interest in one particular thing that is immovable until it shifts completely to something else. And oftentimes, the interesting thing is it oftentimes starts with Thomas the Tank Engine. There's this hyper fixation on Thomas the Tank Engine, and they know every character, everything. And then it will shift sometimes to dinosaurs, or
dinosaurs are big.
But dinosaurs are really big. Star Wars.
Or some other movie that they've seen.
Yeah, oftentimes it's Star Wars or Indiana Jones, those kinds of movies. And then as they get older, it can shift into different things.
But what happens,
it's a very restricted range of interests.
That's right. With most children, they have multiple interests. So they're interested in food and friends and movies and books, and they have this range. They have many interests. None are very deep.
Right.
Children with autism have a very narrow interest.
Right.
And very deep.
Right.
They become experts very quickly in what they do.
Yeah.
But what they do is usually limited to one or two things at a time.
Right.
Very narrow, but very deep.
Right.
Compared to other kids who are multiple interests, but very shallow interests.
Right.
Right.
So especially those that are verbal, you'll see them come into the office and you'll talk with them, and they know that 15-syllable dinosaur name.
Right.
And it's like
they do.
And they can differentiate this dinosaur from this dinosaur, even though they look exactly the same. They can differentiate them
because they're not cluttered with a lot of stuff.
Right.
They're just very narrowly focused, and so they're able to learn these things at a very deep level because they're not cluttered up by friends or other relationships.
Right. Yeah. You also see in those with autism, many times you'll see stereotypic behaviors. Right. So that's where you get the hand flapping or sort of repetitive behaviors that are almost tick-like at times.
Yeah, they are.
But they're stereotypic behaviors. And when we look at their play is also very rigid and very restricted. And so we don't see a lot of imaginative play with them. Sometimes parents will think what their kids are doing is imaginative play, so they'll have cars and doing different things. But as you really get in there and look, oftentimes what you see is they're doing exactly the same thing every single time. Right. So even though it may present as imaginative play the first time, by the 4th or 5th or 12th time, you're seeing that it's just a repetition. Sometimes you see things called a phenomenon called echolalia, where they're repeating what else they've heard. There are a lot of kids with autism who most of their communication, we'll talk about this in another podcast later this week, where most of their communication are movie quotes. Right. So they're taking clips from movies, and that's their primary way to communicate. Right,
because they will tell you, older children with autism will tell you that they memorized lines to use because they can't generate language. Right. They can't generate a response, an appropriate response, and so they memorize these little lines from movies or they've heard from other people, and they use those lines because they can't generate their own. Right. So, and they will say, it's like I'm in a movie. I have to memorize my lines.
And that's for those who develop in such a way that they can communicate those kinds of things and have that kind of insight. Right. Just a few final notes about autism in general is that there is a range of abilities and the ways in which they develop that is also sort of based upon their underlying intellectual ability.
That's right. It's a huge variable. Right. Underlying intellectual ability. So
if they have strong intellectual skills, and what we're talking about is, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate the fact that when we're talking about intellectual skills, we're talking about what we can measure. Just because we can't measure their intellectual abilities doesn't mean that they don't have intellectual skills, of course. But when we are looking at the things that we can measure, when kids are good at those things, they tend to and have higher scores on intelligence the way that we measure it. Right. They tend to fare better because that usually means that they have more verbal skills and the ability to gain some appreciation of the other skills that we're trying to teach them.
Right. The way I typically put it is I talk about measured intellectual abilities. Right. The problem, it's not a problem, but what we have to remember is that it is those measured intellectual abilities that children use, A, in school, and B, in social relationships. Right. I mean, that's what IQ tests measure. Problem solving, expressive language, receptive language, appropriate social interactions. Right. That's what we measure when we say measured intellectual abilities. But those are the skills that they need in school and in relationships. Right. So they do become important because those are the skills that we want to use in everyday life. Absolutely. And especially in school. But we use the term measured intellectual abilities. Right. With every disorder, every condition, whether it's ADHD, dyslexia, Down syndrome, autism, one of the variables is measured intellectual ability.
Right.
You know, it's like kids with reading disabilities. But kids with reading disabilities who have very high measured intellectual abilities tend to do better than children with low measured intellectual abilities. It's the same with autism. It's the same with Down syndrome.
Right. And that's often because the things that we tend to measure
and
when
value.
it comes to intellectual ability looks at adaptability.
That's right.
And as you said, looks at learning ability. And so if you are able to learn some of these things that we're trying to measure as we look at measured intellectual ability, then that suggests that you have the capacity to learn and to pick up new skills and stuff. And so that's where that comes in.
Because we have to do interventions to teach children things, and those who learn things quickly tend to progress faster and farther than those who don't.
Right, absolutely. So over the next few podcasts, we're going to talk about different treatments and some different perspectives of all of this. So definitely return and stay tuned for more information.
And if you have information that you'd like to add, we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
So please contribute.
Yep. So until next time, have a great day. And I almost lost what I was going to say.
I was shocked.
I don't have cue cards. So until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.